I slept in the barn the night I found out what they did to Grandpa's land. Before I tell you what I discovered out there, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story is going to shake you. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. I was 19 when Mom sat me down at our kitchen table in Portland and told me we needed to talk about the farm. Grandpa had died 6 months earlier, and I'd barely had time to process losing him before the lawyers started circling. He'd left everything to me, she said, the whole property in eastern Oregon, 80 acres of wheat fields, the old farmhouse, the barn where he'd taught me to ride when I was 7, all of it mine. But there was a problem. My Uncle Derek, Mom's brother, had been living on the property for the past 3 years. Grandpa had let him stay there after Derek lost his job in Seattle, and now Derek was claiming he had a verbal agreement with Grandpa. He said the farm was supposed to go to him, not to some granddaughter who'd only visited twice a year. He'd already hired a lawyer. Mom looked exhausted when she told me this. She'd been fighting with Derek for months, trying to get him to accept the will. But he refused to leave. He'd changed the locks on the house. He'd started selling off equipment. And, according to the property manager Grandpa had used, Derek was bringing in people Mom didn't recognize. Strangers who were doing something out in the fields at night. I should have been angry, but mostly I felt numb. I'd loved Grandpa more than almost anyone. He was the one who taught me that hard work meant something, that land was more than just dirt and grass. It was legacy, it was family, and now someone was trying to take that away from me, using it for God knows what. The lawyer Mom hired was nice enough, but he was honest about the situation. Verbal agreements were tricky in Oregon, especially when the person who made them was dead. Derek had witnesses who'd swear Grandpa promised him the farm. The will was clear, but fighting it would take time and money we didn't have. He suggested we try to negotiate, maybe offer Derek a cash settlement to leave peacefully. I didn't want to negotiate. I wanted to understand what was happening out there. So 2 weeks later, I borrowed Mom's car and drove the 4 hours to the farm without telling anyone where I was going. The property looked different when I arrived just after sunset. The fields that should have been harvested were overgrown with weeds. The barn's paint was peeling worse than I remembered. And there were vehicles parked near the equipment shed that definitely didn't belong to Grandpa. Expensive trucks and SUVs that seemed out of place on a struggling wheat farm. I parked down the road behind a stand of pine trees and waited. I'd brought binoculars, a flashlight, and my phone fully charged. I didn't have a plan exactly, just a need to see what Derek was doing with Grandpa's land. Around 9 o'clock, lights came on in the barn. Not the regular overhead lights Grandpa used, but bright work lights like you'd see on a construction site. I counted at least 6 people moving around inside, carrying equipment and boxes. None of them looked like farmers. I crept closer, staying low in the drainage ditch that ran along the property line. The barn doors were open, and I could see inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. They'd converted the entire interior into some kind of processing facility. There were tables covered with plants I didn't recognize at first, industrial fans running, and people wearing masks and gloves as they worked. It took me a full minute to understand what I was looking at. They were growing marijuana on Grandpa's farm, in his barn. I knew Oregon had legalized recreational cannabis years ago, But this didn't look like any legal operation I'd seen. There were no official signs, no permits posted, nothing that suggested this was registered with the state. This was an illegal grow house, and Derek had turned Grandpa's legacy into a front for it. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. I documented everything I could see. The plants, the equipment, the people working, the vehicles. I recorded video of Derek walking through giving orders, completely comfortable in his role as boss of this operation. I was so focused on filming that I didn't hear someone approaching from behind until a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to find a man I'd never seen before, tall and angry-looking, demanding to know what I was doing on private property. I tried to run, but he was faster. He grabbed my phone, and for a terrifying moment I thought he might do worse. But then Derek's voice called out from the barn, asking what was going on. When Derek saw me, his face went through about 5 different emotions before settling on forced friendliness. He told the man to let me go, that I was family. But his eyes were cold as he walked over. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. "Checking on my property," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The farm Grandpa left me." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your property? We'll see what the court says about that. In the meantime, you're trespassing. You should leave before someone gets the wrong idea about why you're sneaking around in the dark." The man still had my phone. I could see him scrolling through my photos, deleting them one by one. All my evidence was disappearing right in front of me. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. I drove back to Portland that night, shaking with anger and fear. Derek had let me go, but not before making it clear that if I told anyone what I'd seen, he'd deny everything. It would be my word against his, and who would believe a 19-year-old girl over a man who'd been living on the property for 3 years? I told Mom everything as soon as I got home. She believed me immediately, but she also looked terrified. If Derek was involved with illegal drugs, he wasn't going to give up the farm without a fight. And we had no proof anymore. He'd deleted all my photos, but I'd been smarter than Derek realized. Before he caught me, I'd uploaded several videos to cloud storage, using my phone's automatic backup. When I checked my account the next morning, they were all there. Grainy footage of the grow operation, of Derek directing workers, of plants drying on industrial racks. Our lawyer looked at the videos and got very serious. "This changes everything," he said. "This isn't just about inheritance anymore. This is criminal activity. We need to contact the police." The next week was a blur. We met with the county sheriff's department and showed them the evidence. They were interested, very interested. Apparently, they'd been investigating illegal grow operations in eastern Oregon for months, and this footage gave them probable cause for a warrant. The raid happened on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there, but the lawyer called me as soon as it was over. They'd found exactly what my videos showed: hundreds of plants, processing equipment, evidence of sales to unlicensed distributors. Derek and 4 other people were arrested on the spot. But the story didn't end there. As the investigation continued, they discovered something even worse. Derek had been selling off parcels of Grandpa's land to pay for the operation. He'd forged documents, making it look like Grandpa had given him power of attorney before he died. He'd sold 20 acres to a development company and pocketed the money. The fraud charges were added to the drug charges. Derek's verbal agreement claim fell apart when prosecutors proved he'd been lying about Grandpa's intentions from the start. The witnesses he'd found were people he'd paid to back up his story. The whole thing was a con designed to steal the farm and use it for his illegal business. The court case took months to wind through the system, and during that time, I was stuck in limbo. I couldn't take possession of the farm while the legal issues were being sorted out, but I also couldn't just sit in Portland doing nothing. So I started researching everything I could about farming, about wheat production, about soil management, and crop rotation. I watched videos, read books, and joined online forums where farmers shared advice. One of those forums connected me with a woman named Sarah, who ran an organic farm about an hour from Grandpa's property. When I told her my story, she offered to let me work on her farm while I waited for the legal situation to resolve. I'd get hands-on experience, and she'd get free labor. It seemed like a fair trade. Those months working for Sarah changed everything I thought I knew about farming. Grandpa had run a conventional wheat operation, but Sarah showed me alternative approaches. She taught me about soil health, about the importance of biodiversity, about working with the land instead of just extracting from it. We spent long days in her fields, and she answered every question I asked with patience and wisdom. She also told me about her own journey. She'd inherited her farm from an aunt who'd had no children, and she'd spent years figuring out how to make it work. "The learning curve is steep," she said one afternoon, as we repaired a section of fence. "You're going to make mistakes. You're going to lose crops to weather or pests or your own inexperience. But if you stick with it, if you really listen to what the land needs, you'll figure it out." I asked her if she ever regretted choosing this life. She'd had a career in software engineering before moving to the farm, and part of me wondered if she missed the stability and predictability of office work. "Not once," she said firmly. "This life is hard, but it's real. I go to bed tired every night, but it's the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from actually building something that matters. You can't fake that satisfaction." Her words stayed with me through everything that came next. When the prosecutors finally built their case against Derek, I had to testify about what I'd seen that night at the farm. Sitting in that courtroom, facing my uncle across a room filled with strangers, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Derek's lawyer tried to paint me as a spoiled kid who couldn't accept that Grandpa had changed his mind about the inheritance. He suggested I'd fabricated the evidence, that the videos were somehow staged or manipulated. He made me sound like a liar and a troublemaker, but the prosecutor was better. She walked the jury through the timeline of Derek's fraud, showing how he'd systematically dismantled Grandpa's operation to fund his illegal business. She brought in experts who analyzed the videos and confirmed they were authentic. She presented financial records showing Derek had deposited nearly $200,000 from illegal sales and land fraud. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Derek guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, I watched his face crumple. For just a moment, he looked like the uncle I remembered from childhood, the one who used to bring me candy and make jokes at family dinners. Then the moment passed, and he was just a criminal being led away in handcuffs. Mom cried through the whole thing. She'd lost her brother, maybe not to prison, but to the choices that led him there. I held her hand and felt nothing but emptiness. There was no satisfaction in winning this way. 3 months later, I stood in the barn with a work crew I'd hired to clean it out. Every trace of Derek's operation was being removed. The equipment was gone. The modified electrical systems were being replaced. And the barn was slowly returning to what it used to be. The property manager, an older man named Bill, who'd worked with Grandpa for 20 years, walked through with me assessing the damage. He'd been forced out when Derek took over, threatened into staying quiet. Now he was back, helping me understand what needed to be fixed. "Your grandpa would be sick about what happened here," Bill said as we stood looking at the empty space. "But he'd be proud of you for fighting back. That took guts, especially going out there alone." Bill became my mentor in those early months. He knew everything about Grandpa's operation, from which fields drained poorly in spring to which equipment dealers offered the best prices. He was patient with my questions and honest about my mistakes. When I planted the wrong variety of wheat in a field that was too wet, he didn't sugarcoat it. He told me I'd wasted money and time, but he also showed me how to fix it for next season. The neighboring farmers were harder to win over. They'd known Grandpa for decades, and they saw me as a kid playing at farming. I got skeptical looks at the grain elevator and polite but cool responses when I tried to join conversations at the feed store. I understood. I had to prove myself before they'd accept me. That chance came during my first harvest. I'd spent months preparing, checking equipment, monitoring the crop, watching weather forecasts obsessively. When the wheat was finally ready, I hired a custom harvester and spent 3 days working 20-hour shifts to bring it in. Bill supervised, but I did most of the work myself. Running grain trucks, managing logistics, making decisions about when to cut and when to wait. On the last day, as we were finishing the final field, one of the neighboring farmers stopped by. His name was Tom, and he'd been farming the land adjacent to Grandpa's for 40 years. He watched me work for about an hour without saying anything. Then he walked over as I was shutting down for the night. "You did good," he said simply. "Your grandpa would approve." Those 5 words meant more to me than any legal victory. Tom started inviting me to the informal gatherings where local farmers met to share information and solve problems. Other neighbors followed his lead. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept that I wasn't just some city kid who'd lucked into property. I was trying to be a real farmer. I inherited more than just land that year. I inherited the responsibility of protecting something Grandpa had spent his life building. The fields needed to be restored. The house needed repairs Derek had neglected. The barn needed to become a barn again, not a crime scene. I moved to the farm full-time that fall. I'd been taking community college classes in Portland, but I transferred to a program in agricultural management at the university 2 hours away. I could commute and work the farm with Bill's help. Learning to be a farmer at 19 was harder than anything I'd ever done. I woke at 5 every morning to check irrigation systems and equipment. I spent long days in the fields repairing damage from years of neglect. My hands developed calluses, my back ached constantly, and I fell into bed exhausted every night. But I also discovered something Grandpa had tried to tell me during those childhood visits. There was satisfaction in working land that belonged to you, in seeing things grow because of your effort. The first time I stood in a field of wheat, I'd planted myself, watching it ripen in the late summer sun. I understood why he'd fought so hard to keep this place running. The legal battle over Derek's fraud took another year to fully resolve. He eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including illegal drug manufacturing, fraud, and forgery. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The money from the illegal land sale was recovered and used to pay restitution, though the development company that bought those 20 acres fought to keep them. That fight was settled when I discovered something in Grandpa's old files. Paperwork showing that the 20 acres Derek sold were actually protected wetlands that couldn't legally be developed. The development company's purchase was void, and the land came back to the farm. Their lawyers were furious, but there was nothing they could do. Mom visited often during those first years, bringing supplies and helping however she could. She apologized constantly for Derek, like his choices were somehow her fault. But I didn't blame her. She'd lost a brother to greed and drugs the same way I'd almost lost the farm. Derek never apologized. Even from prison, he maintained that Grandpa had promised him the property. He'd convinced himself the lie was truth, rewritten history in his mind until he was the victim. I stopped trying to understand it after a while. Some people would rather destroy something than admit they were wrong. The farm slowly came back to life. I rotated crops the way Grandpa had, planted cover crops to restore soil health, and invested in better equipment using loans from an agricultural bank. Bill taught me everything he knew about managing the business side of farming, about commodity prices and futures contracts, and dealing with grain buyers. I also discovered Grandpa's journals in a box in the attic of the farmhouse. 20 years of notes about the farm, about what worked and what failed, about his hopes for keeping the land in the family. In one entry from the year before he died, he wrote about me. She doesn't know it yet, but she has the heart for this. City kids usually don't understand why anyone would choose this life, but she gets it. Watched her last visit spend 2 hours in the barn with the old tractor, asking questions about every part. That's the kind of curiosity you need to make it as a farmer. Whatever happens to me, I hope she gets the chance to try. Reading those words made me cry harder than I had at his funeral. He'd known. He'd seen something in me I didn't see in myself, and he'd made sure I'd have the opportunity to discover it. There were other entries, too, ones that broke my heart in different ways. He'd written about Derek's arrival at the farm, about his hopes that giving his son-in-law a place to stay would help him get back on his feet. He'd noticed when things started feeling wrong, when Derek became secretive about his activities, when strange people started showing up. But Grandpa had been sick by then, too weak to confront what was happening. His last entries were filled with worry about what would happen to the farm after he died. "I wish I'd been stronger," he wrote 2 months before he passed. "I should have kicked Derek out when I first suspected something was wrong. But I was tired and sick, and I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Now I'm leaving this mess for her to clean up. I hope she forgives me." I sat in his old office, clutching that journal, and whispered into the empty room that there was nothing to forgive. He'd given me everything that mattered: the land, the lessons, the belief that I could handle this. The rest was just details. 3 years after I first slept in that barn, after I discovered what Derek had done, I was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse watching the sun set over fields of healthy wheat. The harvest was weeks away, and it was going to be the best yield the farm had seen in a decade. Bill was retiring soon, but he'd helped me hire 2 young workers who wanted to learn farming. I'd started a small internship program for kids from the city who wanted to try agricultural work, inspired partly by my own journey and partly by Grandpa's generosity. Mom had moved into the farmhouse with me after she retired from her job in Portland. She'd never been a farmer, but she was learning. She managed the business paperwork and handled relationships with buyers, freeing me up to focus on the land itself. The barn was a barn again. I'd restored it carefully, keeping elements Grandpa had built while updating what needed replacing. I'd even found the old workbench where he'd taught me basic carpentry when I was 8. It was still there, covered in sawdust and memories. Sometimes I thought about Derek and what he'd tried to take from me. But mostly I thought about what I'd gained. Not just the property, but a sense of purpose. The knowledge that I was part of something bigger than myself, connected to generations of people who'd worked this soil. I'd also gained something unexpected, a community. Tom and the other neighboring farmers had become friends, people I could call when equipment broke down or when I needed advice about a problem I'd never encountered. Sarah still mentored me, visiting every few months to check on my progress and share new ideas. The feed store owner knew my name and my usual order. The bank manager who'd approved my equipment loans invited me to serve on a local agricultural advisory board. I was 23 now, and I'd been farming for 4 years, long enough to have seen success and failure, good harvests and bad ones, equipment that worked perfectly, and tractors that broke down at the worst possible moments. I'd learned that farming was less about controlling nature and more about working with it, adapting to conditions you couldn't predict or change. Last month, I got a letter from Derek. It was the first communication I'd had from him since the trial. He was up for parole review, and his lawyer had suggested reaching out to family members might help his case. The letter was short, almost formal. He said he'd had time to think about his choices, and he regretted the pain he'd caused. He asked if I might consider writing a letter to the parole board on his behalf. I read it 3 times, sitting at Grandpa's old desk, trying to figure out how I felt. The anger I'd carried for so long had faded into something more complicated. Derek had tried to destroy everything Grandpa built, but he'd failed. The farm was thriving. I was thriving. His actions had hurt, but they hadn't broken me. I didn't write the letter. I couldn't bring myself to advocate for his early release when I still didn't believe he truly understood what he'd done. But I did write back to him, a brief note saying I hoped he was using his time to become someone different, someone who understood that family meant more than money, that legacy was about what you built, not what you took. I don't know if he'll ever change, but I've changed, and that's what matters. The land taught me that protecting what matters means fighting for it, even when you're scared. It means trusting yourself when everyone else doubts you. It means understanding that legacy isn't just what people leave you, but what you do with it after they're gone. Grandpa left me 80 acres and a barn. I turned it back into a farm worth protecting. And someday, when I have kids of my own, I'll pass it on to them with the same hope Grandpa had, that they'll see it not as property, but as family, as home, as something worth fighting for. The sun was setting now, painting the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. Mom came out onto the porch with 2 glasses of lemonade and sat beside me in the rocking chair that used to be Grandpa's. We didn't say anything, just sat there watching the light fade and listening to the evening sounds of the farm settling in for night. "This is what he wanted," Mom said finally. "Not the fighting or the pain, but this, you here, building something real." She was right. Grandpa had seen past all the obstacles, past the uncertainty of leaving everything to a 19-year-old girl with no farming experience. He'd seen something essential, something true about who I was and who I could become. And he'd bet everything on that vision. I wasn't going to let him down. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear about fighting for what's rightfully theirs. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up against family to protect something important? What would you have done in my situation? Drop your thoughts below and check out one of the 2 stories on your screen right now. Until next time, remember that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that matter most.